There were two other deputies outside. They kept hollerin' for him to come out. "She ain't got any money," they kept insisting. Finally he was convinced that I had nothing. This man, I afterward found out, had been a bank robber, but had been sworn in as deputy to crush the miners' union. He was later killed while robbing the post office in Prince. Yet he was the sort of man who was hired by the moneyed interest to crush the hopes and aspirations of the fathers and mothers and even the children of the workers. I was held 26 days and nights in that bare room, isolated for smallpox. Finally, with no redress, I was turned loose and went to Salt Lake. During all those days and nights I did not undress because of imminent danger. All civil law had broken down in the Cripple Creek strike. The militia under Colonel Verdickberg said, "We are under orders only from God and Governor Peabody." Judge Advocate McClellan, when accused of violating the Constitution, said, "To hell with the Constitution." There was a complete breakdown of all civil law. Habeas corpus proceedings were suspended. Free speech and assembly were forbidden. People spoke in whispers as in the day of the Inquisition. Soldiers committed outrages. Strikers were arrested for vagrancy and worked in chain gangs on the street under brutal soldiers. Men, women, and tiny children were packed in the bullpen at Cripple Creek. Miners were shot dead as they slept. They were ridden from the country, their families knowing not where they had gone or whether they lived. When the strike started in Cripple Creek, the civil law was operating, but the governor, a banker, and in complete sympathy with the Rockefeller interests, sent the militia. They threw the officers out of office. Sheriff Robinson had a rope thrown at his feet and told that if he did not resign, the rope would be about his neck. 3 men were brought into Judge Seed's court, miners. There was no charge lodged against them. He ordered them released, but the soldiers who, with drawn bayonets, had attended the hearing, immediately rearrested them and took them back to jail. 400 men were taken from their homes. 76 of these were placed on a train, escorted to Kansas, dumped out in the prairie, and told never to come back, except to meet death. In the heat of June, in Victor, 1,600 men were arrested and put in the Armory Hall. Bullpens were established, and anyone, be he a miner, or a woman, or a child, that incurred the displeasure of the great coal interests or the militia, were thrown into these horrible stockades. Shopkeepers were forbidden to sell to miners. Priests and ministers were intimidated, fearing to give them consolation. The miners opened their own stores to feed the women and children. The soldiers and hoodlums broke into the stores, looted them, broke open the safes, destroyed the scales, ripped open the sacks of flour and sugar, dumped them on the floor, and poured kerosene oil over everything. The beef and meat were poisoned by the militia. Goods were stolen. The miners were without redress, for the militia was immune. And why were these things done? Because a group of men had demanded an 8-hour day, a check weighman, and the abolition of the scrip system that kept them in serfdom to the mighty coal barons. That was all. Just that miners had refused to labor under these conditions, just because miners wanted a better chance for their children, more of the sunlight, more freedom, and for this they suffered 1 whole year, and for this they died. Perhaps no one in the labor movement has seen more brutality perpetrated upon the workers than I have seen. I have seen them killed in industry, worn out and made old before their time, jailed and shot if they protested. Story after story I could tell of persecution and of bravery unequaled on any battlefield. There was Mrs. M.F. Langdon of Cripple Creek. The Victor Record, a newspaper giving the miners' side of the strike, had been arbitrarily suppressed by the militia, as were all journals that did not espouse the cause of the coal operators. Her husband had been arrested because he was the editor of the Record. The military were surprised when, the morning after the suppression of the paper and the jailing of the editor and his helpers, the paper came out as usual. Throughout the night, Mrs. Langdon, working with a tiny candle, had set the type and run the sheets out on a hand press. On November 19, 1903, two organizers, Desmoulins and Price, were going to Schofield when, a short distance from town, a mob, composed of members of the Citizens' Alliance, boarded the train armed with high-powered rifles and ordered the train crew to take the organizers back. In December, Luciano de Santos and Joseph Villano were killed outright by Deputy Sheriff at Segundo. Soon after their killing, the home of William G. Isaac, an organizer, was blown up. He was in Glenwood Springs when it occurred. Part of the house was wrecked by the explosion, the part in which his two little children usually slept. The night of the explosion, however, they slept in the back room with their mother. The family was saved from being burned to death in the fire that followed the explosion by crawling through a broken window. Isaac was arrested and charged with attempting the murder of his wife and children. And so I could go on and on. Men beaten and left for dead in the road, the home of Sherman Parker searched without warrants, his wife in her night clothes made to hold the light for the soldiers, and no arms found. On Sunday in February of 1914, Joe Panonia and myself went to a camp out in Berwyn to hold a meeting, and William Farley and James Mooney, national organizers, went to Beaune. Both settlements lay in the same direction, Berwyn being a little farther on. As we drove through Beaune after our meeting, 3 women ran out from a shack, waving their long bony arms at us and shrieking and whirling around like witches. They jumped right in front of our automobile in the narrow road. "Come in! Come in! Something bad!" They put their hands to their heads and rocked sidewise. They were foreigners and knew little English. "Joe," I said, "we'd better drive on. They may have been drinking. It may be some sort of hoax to get us into the house." "No, no!" shrieked the women. "No drink! Something bad!" They climbed on the running board and began pulling us. "Come on, Mother," said Joe. "Let's go in. I think there has been trouble." We followed the 3 lanky women into the shack. On a wretched bed, covered with dirty rag ends of blankets and old quilts, lay Mooney, bleeding profusely and unconscious. Farley sat beside him, badly beaten. Joe raced into Trinidad and got a doctor, but although Mooney survived, he was never quite right in the head afterward. Farley, however, recovered from his terrible beating. He said that, as they were returning from Beaune, 7 gunmen jumped out from the bushes along the road and had beaten them up, kicked them, and stamped their feet upon them. All 7 were armed, and resistance was useless. Organizers were thrown into jail and held without trial for months. There were deported in April 14 miners who were arrested at Brodhead and then deported to New Mexico. They were landed in the desert 30 miles from food or water. Hundreds of others were deported, taken away without being allowed to communicate with wives and children. The women suffered agonies, not knowing when their men went from home whether they would ever return. If the deported men returned, they were immediately arrested by the militia and put in jail. All organizers and leaders were in danger of death, in the open streets or from ambush. John Lawson was shot at, but by a miracle the bullet missed him. The strike in the Southern fields dragged on and on, but from the moment the Southern miners had been deserted by their Northern brothers, I felt their strike was doomed. Bravely did these miners fight before giving in to the old peonage. The military had no regard for human life. They were sanctified cannibals. Is it any wonder we have murders and hold-ups when the youth of the land is trained by the great industrialists to a belief in force, when they see that the possession of money puts one above the law? Men like President Howell and Secretary Simpson will live in history. I was in close touch with them throughout this terrible strike. Their descendants should feel proud that the blood of such great men flows in their veins. No more loyal, courageous men could be found than those Southern miners, scornfully referred to by citizens' alliances as foreigners. Italians and Mexicans endured to the end. They were defeated on the industrial field, but theirs was the victory of the spirit. End of chapter 13. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox, summer 2006.